The night the music went silent. In Harlem, when the summer heat began to soften and the evenings learned to breathe again, the people came alive with a special kind of hope. It drifted from open windows, rose from stoops, and followed the sound of laughter down Lenox Avenue until it found its way into the warm, glowing doorway of Bumpy Johnson's Jazz Club. The sign above the door was modest, but inside lived a world far larger than wood and brick. Music swayed through the room like a gentle tide, carrying the dreams of waitresses, musicians, dock workers, and poets alike. It was not just a club, it was a refuge. Bumpy had built it for that purpose, not merely as a businessman, and certainly not as a man hungry for power, but as someone who had grown tired of watching his people endure without a place to exhale. The club became a sanctuary where the weight of the streets could be set down for a few hours. On any given night, trumpets spoke of heartbreak, pianos whispered about joy, and voices rose to remind everyone listening that dignity could not be burned, beaten, or buried. Joe Louis visited often when his training allowed him to rest in New York. The champion carried himself quietly, yet the room always changed when he entered. He did not boast, he listened. He watched young boys stare at him with eyes full of courage they had not yet learned how to claim. And when he nodded to the musicians, when he smiled at the crowd, it felt as if the future itself had briefly paused to pay its respects. But beyond the warm lights of the club, another world moved with colder intentions. There were men who resented what they did not understand and feared what they could not control. They wore their hatred like armor and convinced themselves that cruelty was tradition. In whispered gatherings far from Harlem's laughter, they spoke of purity and order, words that sounded clean but were stained with something darker. They looked at the jazz club not as a place of music, but as a symbol of everything they wanted erased. Bumpy knew the danger existed. He had learned early in life that progress never walks unchallenged. Still, he believed more fiercely in building than in hiding. "If we close every door because someone threatens the house," he once told Joe, "we'll end up living in the dark even when the sun is shining." The night it happened began like any other. A young pianist named Clara had her first featured set, her hands trembling just enough to remind the room that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep playing anyway. The crowd listened kindly, then joyfully, then with rising applause that made her laugh between notes. Bumpy stood near the bar, proud not of profits, but of possibility. Joe sat quietly in a corner, tapping time against his knee. No one noticed the shadows gathering outside. When the first crack sounded, many thought it was thunder. When the smoke crept in low along the floor, someone laughed nervously, assuming a kitchen mishap. Only when the heat surged and the lights flickered did panic lift its head. "Out, slowly," Bumpy called, his voice steady as stone. "No running, help each other." Hands moved as one, strangers becoming guardians, hands guiding hands through the haze. Joe lifted a fallen man with the ease of a champion, but the tenderness of a brother. Clara clutched her sheet music to her chest, not for its value, but because it felt like proof that something beautiful had existed here. By the time the fire truly took hold, the room was empty of people and full of loss. From the street, they watched flames consume more than furniture and instruments. They watched memories turn to ash. The fire painted the night orange and cruel, while sirens wailed their sorrow too late to save what had already been taken. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone understood the message. In the following days, Harlem did not shrink, it gathered. Neighbors brought food to the displaced staff. Musicians played on stoops and sidewalks, refusing to let silence win. Joe walked the streets quietly, listening to anger, to grief, to questions that had no easy answers. Bumpy met with elders, with pastors, with young men whose fists trembled with rage. He did not preach revenge, he spoke of endurance. "They want fear," he said softly. "We will give them unity."
Still, justice is a restless thing. It does not sleep well when truth is ignored. 3 days later, the river carried a strange kind of news. A man known for speeches filled with poison was found lifeless near the Hudson's edge, his influence silenced by the same cold water that had once reflected the city's dreams. Authorities spoke carefully. No names were confirmed, no conclusions were hurried. Yet among the people, a quiet understanding spread like morning light. Some chapters end not with applause, but with relief. Bumpy did not celebrate. Joe did not smile. Instead, they stood before the blackened remains of the club, ash still clinging to the air, and imagined what could rise from ruin. Joe placed a hand on Bumpy's shoulder. "They tried to burn a building," he said. "They forgot it was never the building that mattered." Bumpy nodded, eyes steady on the future. And in that moment, before a single brick had been laid, the club was already alive again, not in walls or windows, but in the resolve of a people who refused to let hatred write the final verse of their song. Ashes do not forget, but they remember how to rise. The morning after the fire, Harlem awoke to a silence that felt heavier than noise ever had, and the blackened skeleton of the jazz club stood like a wound left open to the sky, its beams twisted, its windows blind, its doorway still faintly breathing the scent of smoke. And yet even in ruin, it drew people towards it as if the place itself were calling for witnesses, not to mourn what had died, but to swear loyalty to what would live again. And Bumpy Johnson arrived before sunrise, walking alone through streets that had not yet shaken off sleep, his coat buttoned tight against the chill, his mind turning slowly through the faces he had seen fleeing the flames, the hands he had gripped, the promises he had made without speaking. Because in moments of loss, words become less useful than presence, and presence becomes a vow. He stood before the remains of the club and did not look away. Because he understood something that many men never learn, that destruction demands to be acknowledged, not avoided. And while others might have seen only ruin, he saw the outline of a future already asking to be built. And when the first neighbors arrived with thermoses and blankets and quiet sympathy, he greeted them not as victims, but as partners in a long, patient resistance against despair. Joe Louis came later that day, without reporters, without entourage, just a hat pulled low and a face worn with thought. And he walked the length of the burned building slowly, touching a charred pillar here, a fallen beam there, as if by tracing the damage he might understand the shape of hatred itself. And when Bumpy joined him, the two men did not speak for a long time, because grief sometimes prefers silence. And in that stillness, memories rose uninvited. The laughter that once filled the room, the trumpet solos that stretched time thin, the shy applause for young musicians who had dared to hope in public. And Joe finally said what both already knew, that this was never just about a club, that someone had tried to remind Harlem of its place in a world that feared its rising voice. And Bumpy answered not with anger, but with resolve, telling Joe that a place could be rebuilt, but confidence, once broken, took longer, and therefore the rebuilding must begin not with bricks, but with belief. In the days that followed, rumors moved faster than facts, whispers of meetings in distant halls, of robes and oaths and speeches filled with venom. And though no one said the name aloud, everyone understood who had lit the match. Yet Harlem did not answer rumor with riot, nor grief with surrender. Instead, it gathered in churches, in barbershops, on stoops and street corners, telling stories not of fear, but of survival, reminding one another that their grandparents had crossed chains and cotton and still sung, that their parents had crossed factories and strikes and still prayed, and that they themselves would cross fire and hatred and still build. And Bumpy listened to every voice, young and old, bitter and hopeful, because leadership is not about giving orders, it is about carrying the weight of many hearts without letting your own harden. Joe, meanwhile, faced another kind of battle, one that did not throw punches, but questions, because reporters began to ask him about the fire, about hatred, about race, about responsibility. And every answer he gave was measured, not because he feared the truth, but because he understood the power of words in a nation already trembling. And when asked whether violence should be met with violence, he said simply that strength meant standing tall when someone tried to push you to kneel, and that the greatest victory was to force your enemy to see you not as something to destroy, but as something that would not disappear. And those words traveled far beyond Harlem, settling into the minds of young fighters and tired workers alike, becoming quiet armor against humiliation. Yet even as unity grew, danger did not dissolve, because hatred rarely retreats after one failed attempt, it simply changes its disguise. And Bumpy began to notice unfamiliar faces lingering near meetings, strangers asking too many questions, men who listened more than they spoke, and he warned his people not to.
When the streets learned to breathe again. As the walls of the new club slowly climbed toward the sky, brick by brick and beam by beam, Harlem changed its rhythm in ways that were quiet yet unmistakable. Because rebuilding does more than repair structures. It teaches a wounded place how to trust its own heartbeat again. And every hammer strike sounded less like construction and more like a promise kept. And Bumpy Johnson came each morning before the workers arrived, walking the length of the site with a notebook tucked under his arm, sketching not only where the bar would stand or how the stage would be angled, but imagining where laughter would gather, where shy couples might linger, where young musicians would first feel the courage to let their sound rise into the world. And in those solitary hours, he allowed himself to remember the fear of the fire, not to reopen the wound, but to remind himself why this rebuilding mattered, because memory, when used wisely, becomes instruction rather than burden. Joe Louis, between training sessions and exhibitions, visited often, sometimes sitting on a stack of lumber watching the workers, sometimes speaking quietly with boys who hovered near the fence, hoping to glimpse the champion. And he told them stories not of victories, but of discipline, of mornings when his arms felt too heavy to lift, of nights when doubt whispered louder than applause. And those boys listened not because he was famous, but because he spoke like someone who understood what it meant to stand where you were not expected to stand. And Bumpy noticed how the presence of the boxer changed the air around the site, how shoulders straightened, how conversations softened, and he realized that leadership came in many forms, some built from strategy, others from example, and that together they formed a shield no hatred could easily pierce. Yet peace, once glimpsed, rarely arrives without testing itself, and as the club neared completion, tensions stirred beyond Harlem's borders, subtle at first, like a wind shifting direction, then more openly, as pamphlets appeared on lampposts in distant neighborhoods, speeches flared in forgotten halls, and rumors crept back that certain men had not forgiven the river for its silence. And Bumpy heard these stories with the calm of someone who had learned that panic feeds its own enemies. And he instructed his people not to confront, not to threaten, but to prepare quietly, reminding them that dignity is strongest when it does not announce itself, and that survival is often decided long before danger arrives, in the discipline of ordinary days. One evening, as autumn folded itself gently over the city, Bumpy and Joe walked the streets together, passing shops where windows glowed warmly, passing stoops where elders told stories thick with laughter, passing children who played stickball with the seriousness of future champions. And Joe confessed something he rarely said aloud, that sometimes the cheers of the crowd felt lighter than the silence of responsibility, that being seen as a symbol was heavier than being seen as a man. And Bumpy listened without interrupting, because he understood that strength, when carried too long, bends inward. And he told Joe that symbols do not choose their burden, but they can choose how gently they carry it. And in that conversation, two different kinds of fighters recognized the same fatigue and the same purpose, to endure not only for themselves, but for those who needed proof that endurance was possible. The opening night of the new club arrived without fanfare, no banners, no speeches, no headlines, just a simple invitation whispered from neighbor to neighbor, musician to musician. And when the doors finally opened, the room filled slowly,
cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, as if people were testing whether joy was still permitted here. And the stage lights glowed softly, illuminating faces that had once fled through smoke, now returned through hope. And Clara, older in courage though not in years, took her place at the piano again, her hand steadier this time, not because fear had vanished, but because she had learned that fear could be survived. And when the first note sounded, it carried more than melody, it carried memory and resilience, and the unspoken vow that this place would never again be surrendered quietly. Joe sat near the back, wanting to observe rather than be seen, and as the music unfolded, he felt something loosen inside him, a tension that even championship victories had never fully eased, because here, in this room, he was not a fighter, not a symbol, but simply a man listening to the proof that hatred had failed. And Bumpy, standing near the bar, as he had on the night of the fire, watched faces soften, shoulders drop, laughter rise, and he understood then that victory rarely announces itself with drama. It reveals itself gently, in moments when people begin to live as if fear has finally lost its authority. Still, the city beyond Harlem did not forget, and neither did those who once sought to burn what they could not own. And one night, as the club closed and the street emptied, Bumpy received a message delivered without signature, without threat, without explanation, only a reminder that shadows do not vanish simply because light returns. And he read it calmly, folded it carefully, and placed it in his pocket, because he had learned long ago that warnings often reveal more about the sender than the receiver, and he chose not to share it, not to burden those who had only just begun to breathe freely again, deciding instead that protection, like rebuilding, was best done quietly and thoroughly. Weeks passed, and the club grew into its life, hosting young talents, old masters, visiting players from distant cities, becoming once more the heartbeat it had always been meant to be. And with each successful night, confidence spread a little further, into schools, into shops, into the conversations of people who no longer lowered their voices when speaking of the future. And Joe, watching this change, realized that his own battles were shifting, that the ring, though still important, was no longer the only place where he could defend dignity, and he began speaking more openly to youth groups, to workers, to anyone who asked how to endure humiliation without surrendering self-respect. And in doing so, he found a different kind of strength, quieter, slower, but deeper. By the time winter approached, the fire had become a story rather than a wound, told not to frighten but to teach, and Bumpy allowed himself for the first time since the night of the flames to believe that perhaps this chapter was closing, that perhaps the worst had passed. And yet, somewhere beyond the river, meetings still gathered, plans still whispered, and patience still hardened into resentment. And though Harlem did not know it yet, the final test was approaching, not with fire this time, but with choice, a moment that would ask whether revenge or restraint would write the ending of this long struggle. And as snow began to fall, softening the city into quiet reflection, the club glowed warmly against the cold, unaware that its greatest trial was not behind it, but just beginning. The river, the rumor, and the quiet victory. Winter arrived in Harlem with a patience that felt deliberate, as if the season itself wished to slow time and allow wounds to finish healing before spring demanded new beginnings. And the jazz club, now fully alive again, became a warm harbor against the cold, its windows glowing like lanterns along the street, drawing in workers whose hands were stiff from labor, students weary from study, elders longing for stories that reminded them the past had not conquered the present. And Bumpy Johnson watched this return of ordinary life with a satisfaction deeper than triumph, because he understood that hatred is loud only when it believes it has interrupted the future, and quiet when it realizes the future has moved on without asking permission. And each night the music rose, not defiant, not angry, but calm and confident, the sound of a people no longer proving themselves, only living. Yet, beneath that calm, the city still carried an unspoken tension, a memory of fire, of threats, of shadows that had once gathered too boldly. And though months had passed without incident, Bumpy remained vigilant, because experience had taught him that hatred often waits for comfort before attempting to strike again. And he walked the streets late, speaking with shopkeepers, with drivers, with doormen who noticed who lingered too long and who asked the wrong questions, not searching for enemies, but ensuring that fear would never again arrive without warning. And Joe Louis, sensing the same unease, adjusted his own routines, arriving at the club quietly, leaving without spectacle, preferring to be a guardian presence rather than a public symbol, because he had learned that the strongest protection is often invisible. Then, one evening, a rumor returned from the river, carried not by officials but by fishermen and dockhands, men who noticed patterns long before newspapers did. And they spoke of unfamiliar faces asking about past events, about fires, about meetings long dissolved. And though no threats followed, the questions themselves stirred old memories, and Bumpy listened carefully, not to react, but to understand, because he believed that danger rarely announces its arrival with certainty. It reveals itself through curiosity, through hesitation, through the subtle reshaping of silence, and he began to piece together a story not of immediate attack, but of men still searching for closure, still unable to accept that their power had ended not in battle, but in irrelevance. Joe, when told of these whispers, did not suggest force nor retreat, but patience, reminding Bumpy that sometimes the most decisive answer is to refuse participation in someone else's unfinished anger. And together they chose a path that surprised even their closest allies, one built not on confrontation, but on visibility. And they organized a public night at the club, inviting musicians from across the city, inviting families, inviting journalists not to report on hatred, but to witness harmony. And the night arrived, the room filled with laughter, with children chasing one another between coats and scarves, with elders tolling stories louder than the music itself, and inside, the stage filled with sound that refused to carry